Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Atomic Testing Museum's Distinguished Lecture webinar featuring Reba Wissner. We're so excited to have you all here tonight, and I know Reba is excited to be speaking with all of you. We'll start her presentation shortly, and I'd just like to introduce her to give you a little bit of background on Reba. Reba Wissner is an assistant professor of musicology at Columbus State University. She received her MFA and PhD in musicology from Brandeis University and her BA in music and Italian from Hunter College of the University of New York. She is the author of articles on pedagogy, 17th century Venetian opera, Italian immigrant theater in New York City, and television music of the 1950s and 1960s, and has presented her research at conferences throughout the United States and Europe. She is the author of 3 books, including A Dimension of Sound, Music in the Twilight Zone, published in 2013, and Music in the Atomic Bomb on American Television, 1950 to 1969, published in 2020. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Reba Wissner.
Thank you so much. So just a little bit of background on how I got started on this project. This is not exactly something that comes natural to musicology. And so I was doing some research for my Outer Limits book and my Twilight Zone book. And I realized that there was a lack of people really talking about what was happening in Cold War television. And then I came across a book where the author mentioned that nobody really wanted to have any fictional television shows that dealt with the bomb. And I said, that can't be right. And so by the time I finished my monograph, I counted about 159 television shows or something about from 1950 to 1969. One of the things that really interested me a lot was the aspect of atomic bomb testing, which a lot of people don't really know a lot about. The United States tested a lot of atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs, first in the Pacific and then in the Nevada desert. And then you had underground testing and a whole bunch of other different kinds of testing. What really intrigued me about testing was that the government made films and documentaries about the testing to kind of show people what was happening. And what the scientific developments were at this point in terms of testing. And also what they were trying to do is show people that it's really important to test these bombs. This became a bone of contention, especially during the Kennedy administration, where people wanted to make sure that Kennedy was not going to test bombs again. And people were sending letters to Kennedy. They were sending letters to his wife. They were even sending letters to Caroline. And if you ever have the opportunity to go to the JFK Library and Museum, they have a whole bunch of mail that was sent to the Kennedy family about we shouldn't be testing because testing is really, really bad. And what people were learning about testing came from information about things like fallout that the government and the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization was telling people, and some of it was not really that good information, and some of it was accurate, some of it was not. But one of the interesting things was from 1950 to 1969, during this period when there was testing happening in the Nevada desert, what you get is people who are writing fictional television shows capitalizing on this topic. And so I want to actually start by showing a short clip of one of the first films that we have that the US government, in this case, the US Army and the Air Force, put together about testing. One of this was 2 tests that were done for Operation Crossroads. And I want you to pay special attention to the music, because this is really what I'm going to be talking about a lot this evening, which is how the music that was written for these government testing films and these documentaries really created an atomic musical style that found their way into fictional testing episodes television. So this is a example of one of these instances in Operation Crossroads, where one of the bombs, I believe in this case it was Baker, was being detonated. And I want you to listen to what happens to the music.
The bomb. At the control room, Crossroads personnel are checked, then locked in. Dr. Holloway, Los Alamos director, readies the firing circuit. 30 seconds before age hour. Okay. Cameras are ready aboard ship and in the sky. 2, 1, fire.
So here's the interesting thing about the music here. The music here is using it's using an organ, and it's got this very ominous minor sound. The thing about a lot of these films is the composer remains largely uncredited. Operation Crossroads is no exception. But between 1947 and 1969, we have a whole series of testing films that have been put together by the 1352nd Motion Picture Squadron of the US Air Force, also known as Lookout Mountain Laboratory. And I'm really indebted to the work of Ned O'Gorman and Kevin Hamilton, who wrote a fantastic book called Lookout America that talks a lot about Lookout Mountain Laboratory, the kinds of films that they were putting together. But one thing that's really, really interesting is that for the most part, none of the composers are credited in these documentaries, these testing films. There was one composer that we know of that worked for Lookout Mountain Laboratory, and that was William Lavender. It took me a very long time, and it was with Dr. O'Gorman and Dr. Hamilton's help that I was able to identify him. William Lavender got his master's in composition from the University of Southern California. He was a staff composer and sound recording technician for Lookout Mountain Laboratory. So he worked for the laboratory. He wrote the music for pretty much that we know of, likely every film that was put together. Toward the end of his life, he actually wound up writing historical novels and children's books. And so if you actually look up his bio, it's one of the few things you'll find out about him. But he wrote a tremendous amount of music. He was, unfortunately, that we know of, only credited on screen for one of the testing films, and that was for Operation Greenhouse in 1951. But we have a lot of information from Lookout Mountain's reports. And if you're interested in looking more at these reports and looking more at all of this stuff, Ned O'Gorman and Kevin Hamilton's website, lookoutamerica.org, actually has a lot of these reports digitized, and that's actually where these reports come from. Obviously now they're no longer confidential, so they can kind of cross that off, but it tells you everything that LML was doing in a given year. And so we know a lot about what was happening for Operation Ivy in terms of the production, including music. And a little bit about Operation Greenhouse. What's especially interesting is that for these annual reports, which tend to actually be semi-annual reports because they usually go from July to December and then January to June, very few of them actually talk about the music section. And I'm not quite sure why, and it'd be really interesting to find out why. But we know that for at least Operation Ivy and the Continental Nuclear Tests film, we have original scores. And Lavender was writing the original scores. There were a couple of pieces of stock music, but the majority of it was written specifically for the film. And a lot of these films had two different kinds of versions. One was a full version that was classified for the government, and then later on they would cut them down, take out all of the juicy stuff, and then they would let people see it who didn't have security classification. And so we know that there was music being composed here again, specifically by William Lavender, staff music composer. So why am I talking so much about William Lavender? The reason I'm talking so much about William Lavender is because most of these films were films that people were eventually able to see in some form. And so they were familiar with what was happening. And to kind of give the fictional television shows a sense of authenticity, somehow someone, and I don't know who, kind of made it standard that a lot of these fictional testing episodes would wind up having very similar music to the testing films. And so if we look at something, say that O'Gorman and Hamilton mentioned, they talk about Operation Ivy, and they talk about how there's orchestrated music. The earlier testing films have a combination of organ music and orchestral music. And you will get, as we'll see in some of these episodes, orchestral music, but it's in a very different way than, used in a very different way than you might imagine it to be on television of the 50s and 60s. The interesting thing too about this is that all of the music for these testing films that were done by Lookout Mountain were recorded by the Air Force Band. And they had a very distinct sound. And that distinct sound tends to be one, as Mielke says, knock off 19th century romanticism. Sublime persons for the explosions, but with no interest in the atonality or tone clustering used by contemporary composers such as Penderecki for similar programmatic reasons. The desired musical connotation here is that of awe and wonderment, but for the most part, not a sense of chaos and dread. And in some cases, I would actually disagree with this. For instance, in that clip of Operation Crossroads, I think that there is a sense of dread in that organ music that you hear. I want you to take a look at Operation Ivy, because this is really one clip here that really defines the kind of sound of these testing films and later on these fictional testing episodes.
Well, now 30 seconds to zero time. Put on goggles or turn away. Do not remove goggles or face burst until 10 seconds after the first light. Minus 15 seconds. Minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
So you can hear the orchestral swells, very intense music. That's really the best way that I can describe it. It's much more intense than you might see anywhere else. And I think it's with good reason, because they want to show you the power of the bomb. So where does this leave us? From 1950 to 1969, there were that I have found. If you know of any that's not on this list, please let me know. I would love to know. There are 7 films, 7 television episodes that are set in atomic test sites. The Lux Video Theater, Mr. Finchley and the Bomb, was actually also on a couple of other different anthology series. We don't have any of those performances. The kinescopes are lost, the films are lost. We do have in Rod Serling's archives, Rod Serling was the one who wrote the teleplay. We have the teleplay, so I was able to go and read that. It's actually very, very funny, and I really wish that it would have survived. Basically, a man named Mr. Finchley is living on an atoll, and the US government decides that they want to blow it up, and he's the only one that lives there, and they're trying to get him to leave, and he refuses to leave. So they try to use like some sort of psychological manipulation, and it doesn't work. And it's really very, very amusing. Not every take on atomic test sites are amusing. In fact, most of them are not. And all of these other episodes do exist. In fact, you could, if you go down the YouTube rabbit hole, you can find Nightmare at Ground Zero from Suspense, Science Fiction Theater, Survival in Box Canyon, and I believe the New People pilot are all available on the internet if you find it. Secret Island from 77 Sunset Strip, I think, is available on a DVD. And Playhouse 90's Nightmare at Ground Zero, if you're located in New York or California, Los Angeles, you can find it at the Paley Center, and you can watch it there. Same thing with Goodyear Playhouse. The Expendable House is also located there as well. So you can see that the bulk of these episodes are in the 1950s, and it's not really surprising because that's when a lot of the testing was being done. When you get to the New People in 1969, which was one of the last episodes of television that cover bomb testing in the 1960s, it kind of looks back at testing in a very different way, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I want to give you a sense as to what these episodes are about, and some of the hallmarks that come back to these testing sites and these testing videos. So Nightmare at Ground Zero, and my apologies, there will be some spoilers. Nightmare at Ground Zero is an episode of Suspense in which a man named George Vance creates and builds mannequins. And if you know anything about atomic testing, especially in the desert, you know that mannequins were a very pervasive part of that. They put mannequins in the houses and in the cars and everywhere to test and see what would happen if they were real human beings. They actually would even weigh them down with sand so that they would be the actual body weight of a male or female at that time. So mannequins were really pervasive. So at Nightmare at Ground Zero, George Vance manufactures mannequins specifically for atomic testing at Yucca Flats. And he is obsessed very unhealthily with these mannequins to the point where he wants to get rid of his nagging wife. And he wants to do so by taking her to the test site the night that the bomb is supposed to go off, when he's supposed to be delivering the mannequins. And she's nervous because she doesn't like the sound of the explosion. So she takes a sedative, which was very common back then. And he wants to leave her in the bedroom so that when the bomb explodes, bye-bye Helen, his wife. But eventually he has a change of heart and then realizes that that's not the way he wants to go. So the music for Nightmare at Ground Zero was written by Hank Silvern. Hank Silvern was an organist and composer. He wrote the Suspense theme, but the other thing that's really remarkable, maybe not remarkable in this case, is that the score for this is an organ score. And much of it sounds very much like that you heard in Operation Crossroads, and that you will continue to hear in a lot of these other films. So at the opening, this is what you have.
And now, Autolite and its 98,000 dealers everywhere present Suspense.
So right from the beginning, when they pull onto the entrance to the testing area, which later on in the episode, you'll see they actually pan to a sign that says Yucca Flat. You probably saw the restricted area sign at the beginning. It's really telling you that this is not an okay place. And it's not a place that you probably want to be. What Silvern does throughout the episode is he makes it sometimes hard to distinguish if what you're listening to are sound effects or if they're organ music. And that is a very common thing in these. It's hard to tell where you are sonically, partially because the idea of testing on television was a very pervasive thing. There were comments about how it became so mundane that you didn't pay attention to it anymore. There was one article, I think it was in Life magazine, that basically said that you had Life of Riley followed by the Yucca Flat bomb test, followed by a episode of I Love Lucy. And that it was just, you know, kind of like whatever, you didn't really pay attention to it anymore. And so here, this idea that it's all over is something that is sonically present. And then this really continues throughout the episode.
The guy with the dummies, Lance, that's your name? That's right. You know where they go? Yes. Okay, bring them on in. I'll bring the rest of the family right in.
Guy with the dummies, huh?
Yeah.
Well, take a good look. Ain't gonna look like this tomorrow. Ain't gonna be nothing left but the memory.
It's very sonically uncomfortable. And one of the things that Silvern does for this episode is he switches off between the organ and the piano. And typically what he does is anything that mentions family or mannequins or anything like that, you get the piano. In fact, the very first time that we see Helen in this episode, you almost think she's a mannequin, but you hear piano music. It switches from the organ to the piano. So he differentiates between the idea of family versus not family. And so it's very sonically uncomfortable. And so he has the change of heart. And he gets to Helen right before the bomb goes off, and they manage to get far enough away so that nobody gets killed or hurt. One thing that I notice a lot, especially in these testing episodes, is that first and foremost, most of them actually don't feature a bomb detonation at all. They feature, the main plot tends to be you're stuck somewhere that's a test site and you have to find your way out. Many times that actually involves a plane crash, which I'll get to in a little bit. But very few episodes actually show the detonation. This is one of them. And one common trend in these episodes, not just the testing episodes, but in the atomic bomb episodes on television at large, most of the time the detonation is accompanied by no music at all. So completely contrary to what we saw in Operation Ivy, where we had that elaborate, intense music. You get nothing. So this is where George and his wife pull away. He saved her. He's told her he tried to kill her, and the bomb is going to go off.
Bomb on target. Ground zero. over, George? Yes. What now, George? I don't know. What now? We can start again, maybe. Try. We could try hard.
That has to be probably one of the cheesiest endings in all of television. I just tried to kill you, but let's try again. One thing I do want to point out here is that in television episodes and even films that show a bomb detonation, they all tend to come from these testing films somehow. So they're using that footage. But here in this ending, you get that organ music right back as the bomb is exploding. You hear the crinkling of the fire. But then for the very first time, you hear a major chord. So most of the music, if not all of the music throughout the entire episode, was all in minor. Now you start to get this major, this hope of promise of starting again. So you have the destruction of the bomb, but you also have this notion of starting again. So as I mentioned a few minutes, there's this trope of people will wind up crashing, having a plane crash on a testing site. And that they somehow have to be rescued. The first episode that deals with this is an episode of science fiction theater called Survival in Box Canyon, in which a scientist is called back to the test site early for testing because the weather is going to be cooperative, but it wouldn't be cooperative when they plan the test. And his plane crashes. And his plane crashes on the site, and they have to abort the test until they can find him because they assume he's alive. And so this particular episode doesn't really tackle the idea of testing so much, except we get, once the doctor has been saved and he's alive, and by the way, spoiler alert, he's been saved by a computer named Dr. Tovak. He is taken to the hospital, and then they proceed with the bomb test as planned. The composer for this episode is Jack Shanlin, who was a composer and an arranger. Most notably, he was the one who wrote the music for the March of Time newsreels. So he had varied experience with writing music for real life things. And so having something that was a fictionalized take on a real event would not have been out of his wheelhouse at all. And so this is that scene here.
The atomic bomb test, previously delayed by the disappearance of Dr. Barton, is conducted on schedule. The airdrop is accomplished with pinpoint accuracy.
So again, detonation accompanied by silence, and then at the very end, you get some music. This trope continues in 77 Sunset Strip episode Secret Island. So here, a plane crashes on an island. That island happens to be an atomic test site. All of these atomic test sites are fictionalized. They're given, with the exception of Yucca Flat in Suspense, they're all given different names, so like Marno Island and islands that are not really test sites. And so in Secret Island, the whole notion is they crash land, their plane crashes, they don't know where they are, they try and figure out where they are, and something gives a believe we're back. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Let me go back to sharing my screen. So what happens is they figure out where they are, usually by finding a bullseye or mannequins or supplies or something. And so this is the instance in which they first figure out where they are.
No. That's funny. That big black stripe runs right inland from the beach. Looks as though it's been painted on. And where they're close. The big black circle. Did you ever see the bull's eye of a target? That's what that circle is. I read about it. This is Murano Island. When they're going to test drop the hydrogen bomb on.
So a little bit of suspense there. But the idea is that they don't want the teenager who's there to find out what's going on. Of course, she knows what's happening, but she doesn't want to let on that she knows. But one of the ways that she figures it out is by going into one of the buildings and finding all of this surplus, these surplus supplies.
Apple juice. What is this for? 7 times.
So this is really, this episode is almost the outlier because it's unlike the other episodes, very orchestral, and it doesn't have that tone of seriousness that you have in a lot of these other episodes. And I feel like this one is really harkening back to the kind of 19th century orchestral sound that you have in things like Operation Ivy, although again, not as intense. And then probably the one that might be the most unfamiliar to you is a series called The New People. The New People was a series that was created by Aaron Spelling and Rod Serling. Rod Serling didn't sign his name to it. He actually signed, his name is John Phillips. So if you see that it was created by John Phillips or written by John Phillips, it's actually Rod Serling under a pseudonym. The premise of The New People is that a bunch of high school students, college students, excuse me, are on a cultural exchange trip from the United States to the Philippines. And they cause all sorts of mischief. And somebody comes and says, look, if you don't behave, we're going to take you back to the States. And of course, they don't behave. And so they take them back to the States. On the way back to the States, big surprise, their flight crashes. And they're now stranded on this island where they don't know where they are. Some of them got killed, some of them don't. And the first episode is what situates us on the atomic test island. The subsequent episodes, to my knowledge, and having looked at the scripts, don't address the testing aspect. They're just trying to figure out how to start this new population with people who don't usually get along. There's a lot of issues with race and class, and how we kind of make a new society out of this place that people are just not getting along. And so the pilot is really where we're situated on this idea of being on an abandoned testing site. The composer of The New People was Earl Hagen, famous as a composer, wrote some stuff about how to write for television. Any of you Andy Griffith fans might know him as the person who whistles the Andy Griffith theme, also co-wrote the Andy Griffith theme. Very, very prolific television career. So it's not surprising that he would be asked to do something for The New People. So at this moment, the plane has crashed the night before, and 2 of the students are going off to try and figure out where in tarnation they actually are. And so I want you to pay attention to what you see and hear when they discover where they are.
get any idea?
So they still have no idea where they are. And if you have never been creeped out by mannequins, you're probably creeped out by now. Sorry about that. But they're at this point, they're still very confused. They see the mannequins, they don't know why the mannequins are there. And they actually have to ask the ambassador who was sent to them to pick them up and bring them back to the States where they are. But they clue him in, and they clue the others in, that they're somewhere that has a lot of mannequins and a lot of buildings, and they don't know where they are. And then everyone else starts to come out and explore.
Stand that up, will you?
So Hanachek, who's the man with the cane, is asking them to stand that crate up, and then he's going to clear it off and see AEC and see that it's the Atomic Energy Commission. And then he's going to tell them we're on an abandoned testing site. What's really kind of cool about the way Hagen composed the music for the pilot is he does a really good job of synthesizing, no pun intended, the organ music that you get in the early testing films and the early fictional shows. You get the orchestral music from some of those early testing films, and the kind of music that you get on television in the late 1960s. So he's really putting this into perspective. So I want to close by saying that by looking at these testing films, and the nice thing is that these testing films, for the most part, have been declassified now. So you can go online, you can find them, you can watch them. Really interesting stuff that is in these films, kind of interesting to see what people were being told and not told, and things like that. But how the musical vocabulary that was set forth on these films was then carried over to the fictional side of things, which is not something that always happens. And I think that it speaks to the influence of the atomic testing program and the influence that television had at that point, that it was a place where people were getting a lot of their information. And it became something where they capitalized on this atomic mania, where people wanted more about what was going on with atomic power and the atomic bomb, which is why there were so many television episodes from 1950 to 1969 that dealt with the atomic bomb, and why testing was also a pervasive topic. So I'm happy at this point to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Reba. That was an amazing presentation. We appreciate you joining us, of course. And we are opening up for questions. I believe I see some coming in right now. I have a question I always like to ask our speakers. While doing research for this topic, is there anything that surprised you about either maybe the music side of it or just the atomic testing side of it, or somewhere in between?
So a little of both. One of the things that I really was surprised about was when I started this research, one of the things that I started to do was to look at what the government was telling people. I was looking at the manuals and the pamphlets and the flyers that the government was sending out to people, and what they were being told. And then what was actually coming out on television screens in terms of fiction. And what was kind of cool is that a lot of the things that people were being told in these pamphlets were being told turned completely upside down in the television episode. So for instance, people were being told that fallout was not dangerous in a lot of the early pamphlets. But when you get certain television episodes, you get people saying, don't touch that can of food. It's got fallout on it. It's going to get in the can and it might kill you. And so there was this conflicting information, and people knew it was fiction, but it was also conflicting with what they were being told. And there's something to be said about contemporary television and how contemporary television deals with events like this. And so how people were saying, you know, the government is not really telling you the truth, so we're going to tell you the truth in this episode of like Lassie or whatever. And yes, there were like testing episodes with Lassie, not testing episodes, atomic episodes with Lassie. So it's kind of really cool how that works. It also really surprised me that there were a lot of, considerably, considering what else was out there, there were quite a few testing episodes. I didn't expect to have 7 of them, and there's probably more. I probably missed them, but that people were, I have a whole chapter in my book about testing and specifically what the testing aspect did to children who might have been watching. And so now you're taking this idea of testing, which is a really, really heavy topic, and you're putting it on television screens for everyone to see. And that really was something that surprised me.
Thank you so much. So we'll shift over to the chat and the Q&A tab. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop it into either one. We'll be looking at both. The first question we have from the audience: how would you say this type of music influenced other films and TV shows that address the space race age, like the Jetsons? Do you think that influenced them at all? Reba, did you hear the question? Reba, are you there?
Sorry, Zoom is being very uncooperative this evening.
No worries at all. We all have those. Issues with tech. I'm sure everybody totally understands. Now, the question was, how would you say this type of music may have influenced other films or TV shows that addressed other topics like the space race, or the things like that, like the Jetsons and all of that? Would you say that had influence at all?
In some ways, yes, but I think the majority of the influence for the music of those TV shows tended to be along the lines of what science fiction films and televisions were doing. And that's something I also talk about in my chapter on science fiction, is that you get some of the atomic sounds in these science fiction episodes, but majority of what was happening was actually what was going on with contemporary science fiction television shows like Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Time Tunnel and Lost in Space and Jetsons and all of that.
Thank you. That makes a ton of sense. Now, this next person said that since this is also a high point in radio drama in the US, have you seen any parallel uses of the musical idioms in radio?
So I totally lost you there. You dropped out again.
No problem at all. Now, one person asked, since it's also a high point in radio drama in the US, have you seen any parallel use of these musical idioms in radio?
try that again.
All right. The question was, since this is also a high point.
So I didn't get the last question.
So this is a high point in radio at this time, a high point in radio drama in the U.S. Have you seen any parallel use of the musical idioms in radio as well? Is there a parallel between television and radio in terms of the music they used? Were you there?
I'm here, yes.
So the question was, since this is also a high point in radio drama in the U.S., have you seen any parallel use of these musical idioms in radio?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of atomic episodes in old time radio from the 1940s. And so some of these idioms are there very much. And some of the television episodes also, not just the episodes, but the series were actually originally radio. Very much present in radio. In fact, there is a company, I believe it's called Old Time Radio or something like that, where you can buy MP3s of all of these old radio shows, and they have collections, like they have the Atomic Bomb collection and Civil Defense collection. So there's enough of these. There's also Relic Radio, yep. So there's enough of these that they were able to put them on collections, which is actually really cool. And there's so much fun to listen to, you know, and they're not all about the atomic bomb. Sometimes you get ones that are just about atomic power or atomic energy or being exposed to radiation. There's a great one where a mouse family is exposed to radiation, develops the ability to talk, and tries to get them to talk to the president about like getting the mousetrap away from the door in the lab. And it's wonderful. And it's really, really adorable. But yeah, atomic topics are really, really prevalent in early radio, especially and the way the music is being conveyed as well.
That's interesting. Thank you. The next question we have was, now, was there a similar musical choices in the films made in the USSR? Are you aware of any kind of overlap?
That I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that there was a very interesting way that people patriotic music. You will get sometimes rousing orchestral instances of like My Country music that sounds like Prokofiev or Shostakovich, or music that sounds very much in the Soviet tradition. And that's their way of playing what can't be said. So not that I know of in the USSR, but I know here they capitalized on Soviet style music to make their point that the atomic bomb could easily be dropped by the Soviets, who are the enemy.
It's interesting to see that they would tap into that to kind of, like you said, send their message and maybe make a almost a propaganda use of it, which is interesting to hear. Makes a lot of sense. The other question that we had is, did the composers that you found in Atomic documentary or fictionalized TV also compose for other types of documentary and television shows, or did any of them go on to compose for feature-length films? Reba, do you need me to repeat the question?
As for where you can find the new people, I don't know if it's available on the internet anywhere. I kind of had to go through one of those back channels to find someone who knew someone who knew someone to get a copy of the pilot. The script became something that was not what Sterling wanted. It's a pseudonym.
I think we're going to do one more question. Now, did the composers that you found in Atomic documentary and fictionalized TV also compose for other types of documentary and TV shows in addition to nuclear themed ones, or did they go on to compose any feature-length films? Did you notice any different directions that those composers went in, or did you not really explore that?
So yes, the answer is absolutely. And some of these documentaries and PSAs, there was at least one that was done by the American Nurses Association. David Raskin composed that. David Raskin was a pretty famous composer at that point. And so the ones we know their names, yes, we know that they did tons of other things that had nothing to do with nuclear, but there were some whose names we don't know. And so as a result, I can't say. I wish we knew their names. I wish more people were credited. But in a lot of cases, especially for government films, it was par for the course. Just we don't have to credit them, so we're not going to.
Well, thank you so much, Reba, for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure to have you. And it's been great seeing everybody in chat talking about how engaging it was. I know I really enjoyed it. So we hope to have you again sometime. And for everybody watching, thank you again for joining us. Stay tuned for more information on our upcoming webinars. We'll be posting on Facebook and Twitter at Atomic Museum. Thank you all so much. Reba, thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful evening and stay safe out there.